We are very fortunate to be rejoined this morning with Jeremy Scahill, who, of course, is co-founder of Dropsite News, alongside our very own Ryan Grimm. Great to see you, Jeremy.
Great to be back.
So there's a lot of developments to go through with you. Let's first of all put these horrific images up on the screen of, I hate even calling it aid distribution, but whatever you want to call this. What you see here first is the dynamic they've set up where Palestinians are, just running in survival of the fittest, Hunger Games style, to grab whatever quote-unquote aid is available. But it turns even more horrific as Israelis began firing on this crowd, killing dozens of people, and you can see them fleeing, you can see them taking cover here. Jeremy, what do we know about what exactly unfolded here? Because I know the Israelis are completely denying that any of this actually occurred.
I think it's important to remember what Netanyahu and other members of his war cabinet said at the beginning when we started to learn about this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and that is that it was never meant to be an actual aid distribution program, that this was meant to offer the veneer of giving humanitarian aid to Palestinians to sort of quiet down some of the critics from within the pro-Israel camp internationally. Netanyahu specifically said that he had been approached by Republican senators saying that they didn't want the appearance of starvation of the Palestinians of Gaza to affect the ability of the United States to continue funding and arming this war of annihilation. And so that, we just have to put that out there front and center. From the moment that this launched early last week, there have been dozens of Palestinians killed because Israelis have fired on them either on their way to get aid or after they've retrieved aid. I personally know a Palestinian family, 4 members were killed last week after they had gone to retrieve one of these small boxes that barely has enough food for their family. They were killed by tank ordnance, according to survivors of the hit against them. And what we saw unfold over the weekend, many Palestinians are calling it the Witkoff Massacre, named after Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, because anger is mounting inside of Gaza toward Trump and his administration because they feel like they are just completely taking Israel's side and trying to set the Palestinians up with a so-called truce or ceasefire deal that would enable Netanyahu to resume the intensity of the full genocide after either 7 days or 60 days. So what we witnessed here was the Israelis unleash gunfire and other attacks on this crowd. And as videos and reports start coming out of Gaza depicting this, and we start hearing international doctors that are on the ground there describing the injuries that they're treating, Israel then puts out a video that it says actually shows Hamas was firing on people retrieving aid. Well, that video that the Israelis put out has now been geolocated, and it wasn't near Rafah, where this Witkoff massacre, as the Palestinians are calling it, occurred, but actually had occurred at a different time. And it wasn't Hamas that was actually firing on Palestinians. It was a private gang that there's significant evidence to suggest is being bankrolled or backed by the Israelis to operate as kind of an armed thug force that is selling aid to Palestinians. So, and the final thing I'll say on this, Krystal, is that David Satterfield, who was President Biden's top humanitarian aid official and a very, very militantly pro-Israel guy, recently said on a national interview on CNN that there's no evidence whatsoever that he saw during his entire time when he was a senior Biden administration official that Hamas is hoarding any significant quantities of aid or is engaged in any of the kinds of activities that the Israelis are accusing them of. So clearly here what we've seen is a massacre of Palestinians who were lured into this so-called aid trap, where the actual point of it ultimately was set out in the open by Netanyahu: force Palestinians into an ever small, shrinking killing cage, and then force them to depend on the food inside of that killing cage, so that you can either kill more of them or ultimately implement what they keep calling Trump's plan, which is to forcibly deport Palestinians from Gaza.
And Jeremy, can I get your reaction? Help us parse B2. This is Ryan's tweet. He actually said the statement from the IDF about last night's massacre was distributed to journalists. And because Ryan didn't agree to be off the record and this wasn't sent directly to him from the IDF, he actually just posted what was supposed to, what the IDF wanted to remain, quote unquote, off the record. And their statement says, approximately 1 kilometer away from the humanitarian aid distribution site and outside the operating hours of the humanitarian aid distribution site, IDF troops acted to prevent several suspects from approaching the troops. During the activity, warning shots were fired towards several suspects who advanced toward the troops. There's no connection between this incident and the false claims made against the IDF. So, Jeremy, on the one hand, what we're seeing there is an admission of military action from the IDF, right? That's part of the statement. So can you help us understand how Israel is explaining what happened?
Well, I'm really glad that Ryan posted this because it sort of opens this window into what happens behind the scenes that most of the public in the world is never allowed access to. And that is that Israel will send out official statements that make a certain claim in a very clear way. And then they'll sort of brief journalists off the record, not on background, off the record, as a way of trying to ensure that this narrative, as false as it may be, penetrates into the coverage. And you see these claims repeated all the time by journalists. I mean, the track record now is a 19-month track record where Palestinians videotape, witness, and then tell the world what has happened. They're smeared as being Hamas. Fake or fabricated videos or out of context videos or mistranslated documents are then presented to the public. And then it sort of seems like it's well, Hamas says this and the good guys say that. And you even see Israeli officials saying, who do you want to believe, Hamas or an American-run aid organization and the Israeli military? So, what Ryan did was sort of allow people to see just for a moment the way that the propaganda is manufactured. And the reality is, Emily, that all throughout this genocide, we've seen this repeated over and over and over about massive tunnels under hospitals, Hamas using protected facilities as military bases. Israel has never been able to produce evidence for the most incendiary claims that it's made. And they're relying on the fact that many media outlets will take the testimony of Palestinians and accept that that's Hamas's narrative. Many people in Palestine are from different political factions. Hamas did not win 100% of the vote the last time that they had a democratic election. Many of the people that Israel is killing in its war aren't even members of Hamas, not to mention like military members. Palestine is a diverse society, and I think it really speaks to the effect of the dehumanization campaign that the Israeli military can put out a video that has nothing to do with a massacre that it committed. And so many news outlets and just people on social media accept Israel's word for it when 19 months of context and history indicate that you should never believe the first draft ever of what Israel says unless they provide indisputable evidence, which they never do.
Yeah, and the hope is just to push off, to make the conversation and the telling of facts contested. And by the time there's any, conclusive investigation, everybody's moved on. I mean, that's really the goal here, is that I don't think that they believe that if there was actually an investigation here by the New York Times or whoever, with the limited ability they have to penetrate into Gaza, that they would come to the conclusion that, oh, yes, Israel was correct. I don't think they believe that. They just want to push that reckoning off into the future, and then it's contested, and by the time any sort of actual definitive conclusion is reached by the sanctioned official outlets, everyone's moved on to the next thing. I want to go ahead and get you to walk us through what's going on with these ceasefire negotiations, and put the tear sheet up on the screen here, guys, of Jeremy's report. Your headline here is how Israel and Witkoff are trying to strong arm Hamas into a deal that does not end the genocide. And you go point by point through what it was that Witkoff or Hamas and the administration had agreed to, and then what the Israelis are pushing for in this quote-unquote deal. And it seems like there's a number of things here that are meant to be poison pills. So just walk us through the dynamics and some of the critical differences between these two drafts.
Well, first of all, starting a month or so ago, you had direct talks between Hamas and an unusual envoy for the Trump administration, a Palestinian-American academic named Bashar al-Baba. who was a lifelong Democrat that broke with the Democratic Party even before Kamala Harris became the nominee and had denounced Joe Biden as Genocide Joe and said that he felt that Palestinians would have a better chance of ending the war under Donald Trump. And he's actually been very critical of Trump publicly, which is unusual in the sort of, Trump world. But he started an open channel with Hamas to try to work on the Edon Alexander deal. The American citizen who had been in the Israeli military was taken on October 7th, and they successfully did make a deal to release him. And there was supposed to be a lifting of Israel's siege as a result of that, Trump publicly calling for a ceasefire. That didn't happen, but the discussions continued. And basically what happened is that the Americans worked with Hamas and they said, why don't you lay out for us what your terms would be for a ceasefire, but it has to fit within this category. And Witkoff and Baba made clear to Hamas what the kind of bottom lines were. Hamas then delivers a 13-point proposal that fit in line with what the Americans said. This was last Sunday on May 25th. Hamas then announced that it has made an agreement with the United States for a framework for negotiating a ceasefire. Now, in a mediation process or a negotiation process, this is very common. One side drafts something, the mediators look at it, they say, okay, we're going to go now back to the other side. So they were told, yes, this is acceptable, this fits within the American requirements, now we're going to go to Israel. And my sources within Hamas have said that the Americans said, we're going to try to push Israel on these terms. So then Hamas waits. 2 days later, Donald Trump is in the Oval Office. He summons Steve Witkoff to come up in front of the press. And Witkoff had denounced Hamas, saying that what they had given as a proposal was unacceptable, which, from Hamas's perspective was crazy because this wasn't meant to be an ultimatum. It was sort of a starting point from what Hamas's position would be. So Witkoff then says, oh, we're on the precipice of sending out a new term sheet, he called it, to use like a business term instead of a framework for a ceasefire. And what then happens 2 days later is they then come up with what was a draft that was primarily written by Ron Dermer, Netanyahu's top advisor and lead official doing these negotiations. And what they basically did was return to all of Israel's ultimatums. The bottom line on this is that Hamas has made many concessions in this back and forth, but they've identified as minimal red lines that they want a clear path to an end to the genocide. They've said in their own proposal that the moment a ceasefire agreement is signed, Hamas will totally relinquish governing authority and all power in Gaza. This is extraordinary to see this in the document because it's Hamas on the record saying we will relinquish power in favor of an independent Palestinian committee of technocrats. When we then obtained all three versions of these proposals that we published in full last week, and what's extraordinary is that the Israeli proposal took that out. It took out of the ceasefire framework, Hamas agreeing to immediately relinquish governing authority of Gaza the moment a ceasefire is signed. And there's some theories that that have been floating around for some time that Netanyahu wants Hamas to remain in power because he can easily demonize them as a terrorist organization.
I mean, hasn't he effectively said exactly that in the past?
It's complicated. Netanyahu has, for certain strategic reasons, said that the only way to thwart a unified Palestinian state is to keep Hamas in power in Gaza. But there are many other layers to the context of what happened at the time that we could go into if you want. But yes, there certainly are benefits to having a party in power that you have effectively dehumanized, demonized, that is listed on the State Department list of terrorist organizations, the British designation as a terrorist organization. But I think it's much deeper. They even are saying it's unacceptable for Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to be in charge in Gaza. And he has basically acted as an agent of the occupation. That's how he's widely seen among Palestinians. So it's not just about Hamas. It's that Israel doesn't want Palestinians in control of Palestine at all. And that's really what I think the game is here. It's not just about Hamas. It's that we don't want a Palestinian committee. They want probably a puppet sort of coalition of certain Arab nations that have normalized relations with Israel to be the ones that come in as an outside force. They don't want Palestinians in charge of their own political destiny or to continue forward with a path of a national liberation struggle.
And from from the perspective of U.S. interests, the deal that you just laid out, Jeremy, if you're the Trump administration, if you're Steve Witkoff, and you're continuing to get pushed by Israel as they remove the provision that you just mentioned, it seems like U.S. interests are actually being thwarted, and that's separate from what all the disagreements that the three of us have with the Trump administration's position throughout this entire process. But it just seems like U.S. interests are sort of obviously being sidelined or harmed here in this negotiation process.
Yeah, I mean, there were indications going back to Trump's first term and the way he interacted with Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority, things that Trump has said also to Arab Americans. There are indications that Trump understands that the Palestinian struggle for liberation or statehood has very clearly not identified the United States as a party it wants to be at war with. It's why Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are not conducting any attacks outside of the boundaries of historic Palestine. And I think objectively speaking, it would be in the US interest to have a stable, independent Palestinian state that has good relations with the United States. As you know, Emily, as well as any journalist covering this, there are multiple camps in Trump world. And I think what we're seeing here is that the most militant, hardline kind of Zionist camp within Trump's political network, his administration, and his financiers of his campaign, they don't want any Palestinian state. People like Miriam Adelson and Mike Huckabee don't believe there's a such thing as Palestinians. But, Ryan Grimm and I have also heard from sources within the administration that are in a different camp, that are in an anti-interventionist camp, that believe that the United States should not be entangled in foreign wars, that are growing increasingly concerned about Witkoff's conduct. That the idea that he's morphing into an Antony Blinken type figure, when at the beginning he seemed to have some spine. He seemed to be willing to summon Netanyahu and make him understand America has limits with you. Now, there is still some hope, I think, not just among the Palestinians that are negotiating this, but more broadly, that eventually Trump is going to understand that allowing Netanyahu to be in control of agreements that clearly the United States can have the final word on is counter to American interest. It is not actually in the U.S. interest to have someone setting fires all over the Middle East. I mean, really fascinating. When Trump was asked about Iran, at that press conference in the Oval Office last week, where he had summoned Witkoff to make the Gaza comments, he was asked by reporters, about what did he say to Netanyahu, and Trump basically said it out loud. I told him to back off. Mm-hmm. So again, people often attack me and they say, "Oh, why are you believing what Trump says, or why are you believing what Witkoff says?" I'm not believing anything. I'm reporting accurately on it, and I'm sorry that you think that reporting factually on Donald Trump and an issue of massive consequence somehow means that I'm like getting tricked by the Trump administration. This is called basic journalism, and we're going to continue doing it.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.